Hello and welcome to OttaTalk, the City of Ottawa's podcast series where we talk with staff about city programs, projects, and initiatives. Today we are talking about the spring freshet. Are we going to see any spring flooding? Well, by the time you hear this, the answer is probably yes in some places, but we'll be diving into greater detail a little bit later on. What will the city do to prepare? What can residents do? Well, the first thing you can do is keep listening to this episode.
I am sure that we will be flooded with questions after this episode. Our theme music to start the show is titled Concrete. That punchy, jazzy track that you just heard is by local musician Visual. We begin and end every podcast with a local artist featured on the City Sounds playlist on SoundCloud. You can find a link to our playlist in our show notes, and you'll hear more from Visual at the end of our podcast. It's one more reason to stay until the end. So, hi. My name is Shirley Mann, and I'm an operational excellence strategist in the Public Works Department. And that means I have the pleasure of supporting leadership development for supervisors and managers.
Nice. I'm Tom Peckloff. I'm a public outreach and communications coordinator supporting parks maintenance and forestry services. And this time of year, I also serve as a council liaison for the spring freshet. So our topic today is one I've been looking forward to. So welcome to our first episode, the second season of OttaTalk. Now, if you're a regular listener, back on episode 4, we shared tips on how to manage rainwater on your property and keep it out of your basement. We put a link in our show notes. There's good information there, even if you live nowhere near a river. But today, we are talking about riverine flooding. That's what we call it when the Ottawa River or the Rideau River overflows. The most likely time for this to happen every year is during the spring freshet, when snow is melting and the rain in the forecast is just a little bit more often. Now, Ottawa saw its most significant recent flooding in 2017, 2019, and to a lesser extent in 2023. Our guest today, Jim Lethbridge, is the area manager for emergency planning and response and a wealth of information. He's been working on the Spring Freshet Taskforce for 10 years, and we'll be talking to him shortly. Now, I haven't been personally affected by any of the most recent floods, but in 2017 and 19, I was working in a councillor's office in a ward close enough to the river to have some impacted residents. And in 2023, I was in my current position with the Freshet Task Force, so I do know this can be a stressful time for many. How about you, Shirley? Any flood experiences to share?
You know, Tom, I actually don't have any flood experience to share in Ottawa, though I do have flood experience to share in other countries. I've traveled a lot in Southeast Asia during monsoon season as well, and I've actually experienced floods in Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam. And as I was standing there knee-deep in water in the middle of the street, I was reminded of how grateful I am for strong municipal planning and infrastructure like we have in Ottawa.
100%.
So before we get started, we've got a few housekeeping notes. For our listeners, any city programs or services that we talk about during the episode will be in the program notes. So whether you're streaming this podcast, wherever it is, you can search for them on the city website, ottawa.ca. The program notes also have a link to the city's YouTube channel, where you will find our entire podcast archive. And I encourage you to check out all of our previous episodes.
Absolutely. Well, our guest today, Jim Lethbridge, was raised in Ottawa and has strong connections to the Ottawa Valley. He started as a part-time facility attendant back in 1986 when I think Jim was about 5. He must have been. Anyway, he celebrates 35 years of full-time employment this fall. Most of his career has been in facility operations and in public works. Jim's introduction to emergency responses started on the front line during events such as the 1998 ice storm, major power outage in the early 2000s. Since 2017, he has supported numerous responses for flooding, tornadoes, and non-climate emergencies. All the fun stuff. This will be Jim's 10th year working on the Spring Freshet Task Force. Welcome to OttaTalk.
Well, thank you.
Welcome, Jim. So before we start, I know that we're using the word freshet, and I want to ensure our listeners know what we mean. So, Jim, please correct me if I'm wrong. Freshet simply refers to the season of combined spring melt and rain. And we've had a few memorable freshet years. We mentioned 2017 and 2019. What do you remember about those events in those 2 years?
Well, first off, thank you for having me today.
Of course.
For 2017 and 2019, I was a parks area manager. So really, I was just getting my feet wet, as it were, inside of parks operations. 2017, we started seeing rivers rise, and really, we hadn't experienced significant flooding in Ottawa prior to that in recent memory. What it came down to is we pulled a whole bunch of people together under the Emergency Operations Center, and we started coordinating a citywide response. Why was that important? Well, we needed to start monitoring what was going on. We were starting to see the impacts of the snow. There was a lot of snow that year. There were a lot of rain events that occurred, and the water just kept coming and kept coming. And it comes from a long way away. The Ottawa River is 146,000 square kilometers. It's massive. So we had to get our heads around what was still to come, and it occurs over many weeks and months. In 2017, I was supporting logistics, so really it was about getting sand and sandbags out to people, supporting the teams that were doing the responses, and then recovery. So that means getting sandbags back and taking them away. In 2019, I was called back again to support logistics. Again, supporting people getting what they needed in the field. But in 2019, we filled almost 1.5 million sandbags across the City of Ottawa with the help of many volunteers, city staff, Canadian Armed Forces. It was a massive undertaking. The funny thing about 2019, I apologize for funny, but it's the fact that as we were sitting there and water levels had crested for the second time on the Ottawa River, we're at that historic 1 in 100 level. We took a break. We're monitoring. We're waiting for waters to recede. I went back to normal operations. So I thought that night I got a phone call and there's been a tornado in Orleans. So we immediately mobilized over to tornado response and recovery operations, which took the better part of a week. Then we went back to monitoring, and as the waters were receding, it's time to start removing sandbags from residential properties. We were still in a state of emergency, and city staff were mustered to help remove sandbags, not quite 1.5 million, but a lot of sandbags from Cumberland to Constance Bay and everywhere in between. So it was very interesting introduction to Freshet over 2 very significant years. And the real piece for me in 2017 and 2019 was just how heartbreaking it was for residents. They were experiencing trauma. They had not experienced levels of flooding this bad in the past. Some had rebuilt from 2017, and then 2019, they were affected again. Some people were managing insurance claims. All sorts of emotional support was required. So when you're watching from the outside and you're supporting, you get a sense of what it means to be in a flood-prone community and the impact it has on people, individuals, and communities.
Certainly laid the groundwork for why the task force was put together for the ensuing years after, I would think.
Absolutely. After 2017, the city made a commitment under Emergency Operations Center to have an annual monitoring group put together. And what that meant was, for the first years, Office of Emergency Management pulled together a task force and a team of departmental representatives that would monitor the conditions, plan and prepare for initial outputs, often sandbags, and then if it were to become more significant, take additional measures to offer supports. And of course, as we saw in 2019, additional supports ended up being warming stations, access to showers, food in some cases, wellness visits, providing information on insurance, who to contact, what to do. People had power cut off at some point, so reinstating power, getting access back to your home. It just went on and on. It really became a massive citywide undertaking.
It really goes to show that the impact of this requires a holistic system of supports. In addition to just thinking about the flooding, we need to think about the human element of it as well. So thanks for highlighting that.
Yeah, indeed. Now, here is the big question. Of course, the beauty of taping in advance is we probably know the answer by now. Will there be flooding this year? I would imagine the answer is yes to some extent, but can we predict that extent? Do we know whether this year will be comparable to 2023, 19, or 17?
It's a wonderful question, and honestly, I'm asked this question as early as December every single year.
I know you're
trying to forecast what's going to happen in March, April, and May of the next year. And the fact is, it's just too early to tell. Our flood forecasting warning partners, being our local conservation authorities and the Ottawa River Regulatory Planning Board, they have models that take a look at all sorts of factors: snow water equivalent, or water contents, ground conditions, how much there is evaporating, what are reservoir management strategies, and they're putting all this together, and they run models frequently, multiple times a day during the flooding season. Unfortunately, flooding forecasting is also based on weather forecasting. So as we all know, it's very difficult to forecast more than 48, 72 hours in advance with any high certainty. And that means that in 3 months' time, we certainly can't predict what it's going to look like.
You know, Jim, someone told me that the Ottawa River always reaches its peak the first week of May. I don't know if that's true or not, but is it inevitable that we will at least have some flooding every year? I know it's difficult to forecast on a forecast, but what are your thoughts on that?
The City of Ottawa has a long history of flooding, and that's a fact of life here. We have so many waterways, small, medium, and large, Rideau River being a good example of our second largest waterway. They have flood plains that are associated with the rivers themselves. And every year, water is going to enter these rivers in controlled, partially controlled, uncontrolled manners from snow melt and from precipitation. And that means the rivers are going to swell, and we will have some sort of nuisance or onset flooding. What is nuisance flooding? Well, that means, if you've got a park next to the Rideau River, you might see some water coming into the park, covering a pathway, maybe perhaps affecting a wading pool or a play structure or something. More significant flooding, that's where we're talking about roadways starting to be encroached on or overtopped, or where we're seeing residents with their homes being affected, so water up to foundation. So will there be flooding? Absolutely. To what degree, we don't know, but that's why we prepare every year. We understand where our risks are, and we try and help the residents the best we can through our established practices.
So, Jim, you mentioned you get asked this question even in December. I know you and I talked about it in January. Monitoring is not just a spring thing. It happens all year long. But in the spring with the task force, can you talk to us a little bit more about the specific monitoring work that happens this time of year?
Absolutely. So as we're aware, Public Works monitors weather and weather conditions routinely throughout the year. But as we get into spring and preparing for spring freshet, we pull together a task force which has interdepartmental representation, including services like infrastructure services, public information media relations, Ottawa Public Health, Public Works, our geospatial team. And we share information within the task force. So what we're looking at is snow data independently. We're liaising with our Conservation Authority partners. We're getting information directly from Environment Climate Change Canada. We're getting information from the Ottawa River Regulatory Planning Board. So we're gathering the information that's shared by our forecasting partners, as well as corroborating some of what we're seeing using other resources online.
And those conservation authorities are Rideau Valley, South Nation, Mississippi Valley?
That is correct. For the City of Ottawa, we share our land mass with those three local conservation authorities.
Jim, you're talking to us quite a bit about how the task force starts preparing well ahead of time. And I'm aware of one thing that we do to prepare, which is very unique in Ottawa. We blast the ice on the Rideau River. And according to what I know, the Rideau River and other smaller local waterways are the first to see elevated water levels from the snowmelt. And so can you explain to us a little bit about this process around blasting the ice on the Rideau River? And I kind of want to make a big deal out of this. I've seen photos. We're talking giant saws and dynamite, tugboats and exploding ice. It looks like an action scene from a movie.
I kind of want to do it.
Yeah, same here. So, Jim, can you paint us a picture, please? Can you talk to us about this blasting that happens on the Rideau River?
You've painted the picture for me. I mean, you've done so well. Brian Dennis couldn't do it better. Rideau River Flood Control is the name of the program, and it's been around for decades now. It's an agreement through the Rideau Valley Conservation Authority, and it's done in partnership with Parks Canada, Public Works Canada, the dam operators at the Rideau Falls, and it is a roads operation, a very unique operation. So we have supervisors that are set up. They muster at the end of January every year and start preparing for the actual blasting, which ironically just happened this past weekend, February 28th in 2026. As part of the preparatory works, they're out there monitoring the current conditions. So how thick is the ice on the Rideau River? What do we need to do? They're clearing snow by hand in most cases, or a snowblower if they're lucky. But every time you see a freeze thaw or another snow event or a rain event, these poor people have to go back out there and re-clear the snow, auger the ice, do their ice depth measurements, and then are actually physically cutting holes, lines in the ice in order to prepare for the actual blasting event. So this is a massive undertaking that takes the better part of February to prepare properly and make sure they have the proper conditions. As they're doing the blasting, there are hundreds of holes drilled for the explosives to be placed in the ice, and they're working closely with the dam operators to make sure that we're not creating risk for that infrastructure. They also have a communication program. They're talking to their local residents. They've got outreach and monitoring in place. And I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about their safety protocols. Over the years, things have changed, right? They're managing explosives. When they're out there, they've got harnesses on. They've got a massive crane they bring in to make sure they've got safety protocols in place. They undertake specialized first aid training so that should something occur, they are prepared to respond, even though they've got their paramedic teams waiting on the sidelines. They do traffic control. I mean, they're all over the place. This is a massive event that attracts a lot of attention. And for many residents that live right there, it's a rite of passage for spring. We know spring's coming when we see the blasting going on. And their work's not done. So right now, blasting has been completed. They've got their amphibious icebreaker, so a boat with a big grappling hook on it. They've cleared the Ottawa River outfall area. That means that the Ottawa River's able to receive the ice that's coming over the dam. And now they're working their way up the Rideau River towards the Billings Bridge area to make sure we've got sufficient ice cleared to help prevent ice damming and the effects of potential flooding on the Rideau River downtown.
Next year, can you take Tom and I along for this?
I would love to. We'll make it a party.
I'll wear my PPE.
There we go. So to our listeners, you're hearing us refer to right now a lot. We want you to know that we are recording this episode during the first week of March. And by the time you're hearing us talk about this, things have progressed and evolved significantly.
That is true. That is true. Now, and we have talked a lot about what the city does in the monitoring and providing sandbags, but let's shift it a little bit. How can residents who live near waterways, how can they prepare their homes and properties before flooding season?
It's a wonderful question. It's something we should be thinking about from a resiliency perspective. So if you're in a home and you've experienced previous flooding, people at this time of year should be thinking about what happened last time. What are the significant years of flooding that I'm aware of? Did I do something? Did I install sandbag walls? Or what is my frame of reference to my property? It came up to the shed. It came up to my house. It was 6 inches deep at my foundation. So that's the first piece, reflecting your personal history. And I encourage people to share that because we've actually come across situations where one member of the household was responsible for flood protection every year. And unfortunately, circumstances change and that person may not be available in a given year. And the person left at home is struggling. What else can we do? If you're new to a neighborhood, talk to your neighbors. It's important to understand what's gone on in the past in your neighborhood. If you don't know, check ottawa.ca, look at floodplain mapping, verify whether or not your property is in a floodplain or more specifically your house. And if you are, at what level of return is your home potentially affected? So we need to understand that flooding doesn't just happen all at once and it's as high as it ever gets. Waters rise on the rivers, and you may be in a 1 in 2, a 1 in 5, a 1 in 10, up to a 1 in 100 event. A 1 in 100 event is what we had in 2019 on the Ottawa River. A 1 in 100 event has a 1% chance of happening in any given year, but based on all those other factors we talked about already. But what else can somebody do at home? So these are things. You've talked about a previous podcast when you mentioned basement preparations. For riverine flooding, I always encourage people, check your sump pumps. Are they functional? That's great. Do you have a backup sump pump? Do you have emergency power for your backup sump pump? If you've got openings in your basement, window openings you can close in more permanently, that's wonderful. Take things off the ground in the basement, set them up a little bit higher, or remove them from your basement if you're really prone to annual flooding. Direct downspouts away from your foundation, and minor grading. There's a whole list on ottawa.ca that I recommend everybody tune into and watch. But the other piece I would put into it, and it's not necessarily about protecting your home, preparing your property. We've had locations in the past that are prone to flooding, and not at significant levels, but there are assets that sit inside the floodplain that we don't think about. Somebody installs a hot tub, as an example. Well, if the water gets up, it's not hitting your house, that's okay. But what about the hot tub? Will it float away? Does it have electrical supplies? Does that become a risk? We had one instance in 2023 where a very large propane cylinder was being used for heating, and it was within the floodplain. It was not considered during preparations. It actually dislodged. And think about propane tanks floating down the river in an uncontrolled fashion. That sounds like a bit of a problem. And we can help avoid those problems by thinking about what is in the floodplain, what is mine, what can I do? Not only to protect myself, but maybe other people.
Yeah, absolutely. As we're talking about preparation, I wonder how many residents out there are wondering about sandbags. Let's talk about sandbags for a second. Do we need them? Are we going to need them? And where would residents go if they wanted to get them?
It's a wonderful question. And again, it's one of the early things that Ottawa does for residents. We are aware that people may require sandbagging. That's for temporary flood protection, right? So you might have some ditches exposure. You might have some urban flooding. In this case, we're talking about rivers. And if you need to plan to use sandbags, people should really think about what that means. So we've taken some time over the last few years to improve our information on ottawa.ca to give guidance to residents. What do I need to do for sandbagging? What does it mean to fill a sandbag by myself at a station that's at a works yard and then put it in my car and take it to my home and then try and get it and build a sandbag wall around my house? Am I going to do it myself? Do I have some friends, neighbors, community that can help out? How many sandbags do I need? Do I know exactly where to place them? These are all things that we should be thinking about because it's a lot of work in the grand scheme of things. The City of Ottawa does make sand and sandbags available at sand filling stations. They're strategically placed at locations that are in flood-prone communities across the city. We don't put them all out at once. We start with known areas of potential concern. And as we speak, today's taping date, we have 4 sandbag stations currently filled, 2 downtown, Herdman Yard, and at Industrial, 1 in our West End at the John Shaw or Kinburn Works Garage, and 1 in the South End at Roger Stevens Drive. So residents can more easily access the sandbag for their own use, and they're generally in decent spots that we can control on city property for their access.
Excellent. And remember to visit the city website to find out more information if you're looking to access sandbags.
Yeah, and I would just add that if my memory serves me, at peak we have anywhere from, could be up to 10 to 15 different sites on the West End and the East End, I think.
And really it is dependent on how significant is flooding becoming, because we would change our stance and put out more stations in community hub locations like a Constance Bay Community Center, or perhaps even roadside locations, which are more convenient, but still safely located so that, traffic is not a big concern for people. But traffic safety, personal safety is one thing that we consider as we're setting a lot of our assets out and as we're getting our teams deployed for work.
So how can residents get the latest updates on river levels and flooding information?
For river levels, let's go to the source. Go to your local conservation authority. I've mentioned our 3 local, Rideau Valley, Mississippi Valley, and South Nation. They are the ones that have all of the reporting data. They are the ones that provide forecast warnings and flood statements. For the Ottawa River, go to Ottawa River Regulatory Planning Board. They are the ones that provide the levels, the flows, and provide, during Freshet, 4-day forecasts of where levels are anticipated to reach. The thing I would always caution people on is when they're talking about that 4-day forecast, just because you see a high number doesn't mean that's a peak. That's something that we talk about quite often. We're always worried about finding the peak. What is the highest level water is going to achieve? And again, because it is so volatile in terms of forecasting and weather, we need to understand that we are in a monitoring phase for an extended period of time. It's important for people to watch. Also, go to ottawa.ca. We have a current situation page for river flooding. We will provide updates on what our tactics are, the supports that are being offered, locations of sandbag filling stations, and all sorts of information about floodplains and personal preparedness. And as always, if there is a concern, you can report information to 311 and ottawa.ca for us to review.
It sounds like one of the takeaways really is to go to ottawa.ca.
Absolutely.
And just as a reminder, don't forget that in the show notes, we have a direct link to the flooding information page. So make sure to check those show notes. Jim, you've shared so much information here, and I'm wondering if there's anything else you want to share on this topic with our listeners.
Really, there's 2 things. The first of which is we always talk about flooding in the spring, and this is a response piece. We're protecting from flooding, but one thing we should be thinking about year-round is mitigation. Are there things we can do outside of flood season that would maybe prevent future flooding from happening? If not all of it, some of it. What is your flood risk becomes part of this. So I really want people to understand they need to understand their flood risk, right? Go to floodplain mapping, take a look at your personal property, understand how flooding may affect your neighborhood, streets into your area, what it means for you as an individual. And we should all be thinking about that planning piece. But one of the very first things I should be mentioning right now is every time waters are rising, water safety statements come out. Why is that critical? When you're walking next to rivers, Waters are rising. They're coming in more quickly. We need to be aware of our surroundings, our ground, our footings, slippery surfaces. Take care of yourself, your children, and your pets. No ice is safe ice at this time of year, and fast-moving water can really have an impact on people's lives. So I want people to be cautious around waterways.
Thank you so much, Jim, not only for what you do for the city and our residents. Thank you for spending some time with us this afternoon and helping us learn a little bit more about the Freshet. And while we thank you for the information, we sincerely hope that we won't need it this year.
I appreciate that. Thank you. And it is a team effort. It is not a one-person piece here. So really, it's many departments, many hands, and thanks to everyone for their help.
Well, this is the end of the podcast, but not the end of the conversation. Remember to visit ottawa.ca for more information about the programs you heard about here. Be on the lookout for upcoming announcements about more City of Ottawa podcasts. That's when we OttaTalk about something completely different. To play us out, here is a little more of Concrete by Visual from the City Sounds playlist on SoundCloud.